So the next thing I plan on doing is I need to take off the tie rods, and then eventually my goal for today is to take the spindle off of the ball joints and be done with that in order to give myself more room to work and make it easier to video as well. I'm going to take off the caliper and the rotor and all that along the way. So what I wanted to point out here is on these brakes on the Corvette, there's a pin here, and it's got little, well, this has a cotter pin. Sometimes they're just kind of like hitch pins. But you take that out, remove that pin, and you can pull the brake pads out. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to pull the rotor off with them on it. I'll take those off later. But the drawback to that is these Corvette pistons and the calipers have springs in them, and they tend to push the pistons out, and then it makes it difficult to get the new pads back in. So they do make a little plate that you put in there that's used to push them back. I've never used it, but I know they make it. So there are two bolts with 5/8 inch heads on the back that will hold the caliper on. Let's see, maybe I don't actually need that extra leverage. No, I don't. So that's what holds the caliper to the caliper mount. And actually, I can see that the pistons, I don't know if I'll be able to get it on the camera. The pistons are already extended out. On this one. See if they can zoom in on that. You see these inboard pistons right there, the shiny thing. That's the piston coming out of the caliper pushing against the brake pad to keep it up against the rotor. I'm just going to take these off. And before I do that, I'm going to have to take that clip that holds this brake line on to the frame. I'm going to have to take that off. Drop the lock washer. I'll have to find that. It's a fine thread bolt. Takes a while to loosen it. Tool to get the clip off of that brake line. And the caliper just lifts right out. Now, by the time I am done with this, I will have taken these calipers apart and painted them and rebuilt them. And when I put them back in, those pistons will be pushed back, so it won't be an issue getting the pads in. So there's the brake caliper off. The next thing we're going to do is take off the rotor. I'm going to pry this cap off, and underneath that cap is a nut, and that nut has a cotter pin in it. And unlike modern cars, these are not torqued down to like 80 or 90 pounds like they are now. What you do when you're reinstalling them is you spin that while you're tightening it, and you tighten it to, I believe it's 12 foot-pounds. And then you actually back it off to the first place you can put the cotter pin through. And you get a nice freewheeling bearing. And that's the way it works. I need to go get pliers to get that cotter pin off, so I'm going to temporarily shut off the video. Okay, I've got the cotter pin bent. I didn't take it out yet. So there's a good close-up on the nut. And just to demonstrate kind of how loose these are on, once the cotter pin's out, you can almost do it by hand. Gonna make a liar out of me. I have had them where you take the cotter pin out and you just can turn them. They're not on very tight at all. What I always do is I use this cap to set the bearings and the nut in and everything in the order that it comes out. Not sure. I think this might be one of those things where I can't put it back on, so that I remember where it goes. So this might be something that I have to actually label and put away. But you just want to rock that a little bit and get the bearing and the washer off. And the bearing and washer are going to go in there. And there's a groove in that spindle where that little tab fits in that groove. So that washer doesn't spin. The only thing it spins is the bearing. And this used to be a maintenance item. You used to have to repack wheel bearings on the older cars. It's not something you have to do nowadays. I know I'm getting those a little bit greasy, but the last thing I always do before when I put brakes on is I make sure that I use brake cleaner on everything. Now, and again, this is purely to make it more visible. I think I can take this off of that and make the job of dropping the ball joints more visible to the camera without impacting anything. No pun intended. That's the right size socket. It is not. That's a 3/4. I had a 13/16 like nuts. I should probably give you a better view of what I'm doing. Don't think the camera's capturing. It from that angle. Nope. Let me move the camera a bit and get it. Focus. Basically, all I'm doing is taking this backing plate off, which will also result in the caliper mount coming off. I want to make sure that I can see, yes, I can see the caliper mount. There are 3 bolts holding that backing plate on. 1, 2, 3. That looks to be a little bit bigger than 3/4. It's also bigger than 13/16. I have to find a nut for it. And this one here has little tabs that sometimes are bent against it to keep that nut from coming out. It's actually a bolt, I should say. And I might need a wrench to hold that in the back. So the 2 bottom bolts are 3/4. Calculated on that. This resulted in the tie rod end coming off. Not the end, the whole tie rod. So I will stick that in the vise and take this one out. But we're down to the ball joints, so what's holding the spindle on. Ball joint and then the upper ball joint. Okay. This is the backside view of the caliper, and I put the mounting bracket back onto it just to keep them together and such. Probably should have pointed this out before. When you're taking the caliper off, there's two bolts right close together. The 5/8 one is to take the caliper off. You don't want to take the bigger one off and a bigger, I can't even get the socket on that. So it's a bigger socket. But you don't want to take that apart because that's what holds the two halves of the caliper together. The only time you need to take those out is when you're rebuilding the caliper. So that's a thing worth noting. I'll turn this around and see if we can get a look and see the pistons. There's two pistons. And there's two pistons over here as well. Those are what have to be pushed back if you're just changing pads. They have to be pushed back into the caliper so that you can get the pads in over the rotor. So there's the tie rod and the connector to it that connects to the steering knuckle in the vise. And this is an example of a really rusty nut and cotter pin that is probably going to give me trouble taking it out. So here goes. Either it's really rusty or that is so covered with grease it looks like it's rusted in. Try to straighten it out as best I can with pliers. Needle nose work pretty well for that. And then I have a little pick. Hopefully I can move it out. It's starting to come a little bit. Once you get it to where you can get the needle nose pliers in it, that's always a better option. And if you can tap it with something, it came out. That was a little easier than I expected it would be. It's a 5/8 inch nut on there. Yeah, that's going to be a good job for the impact wrench. Okay, we're ready to fire up the impact wrench. And one of the things I was thinking about, I guess it was this morning, when I was trying to use the air hammer to dislodge one of the joints yesterday. It was one of the ones that was on the drag link, and that drag link wasn't too solid. So I'm going to try that technique again today and see if we have any more success today than we had yesterday. And the reason why I'm trying this again today is because the drag link was able to bounce around. And I think I got the thing here in the vise tighter than it was. So there'll be less play in this. And more of the force will be directed to the stud I'm trying to remove. Now, so much for that being tighter. But it worked. So now I'll just take the nut off again. I had to pry down a little bit on this to get some friction against that ball joint because it was spinning there for a second. But one of the tie rods is off. The other one I will do on the car, or on the chassis, what's left of the car I should say. So the two screws, or bolts I should say, that hold the, I don't even know what this part is called, but it's the, it goes from behind the knuckle to the tie rod end here. These two bolts are different lengths because one of these knuckles is thicker than the other, so obviously the long one goes in the thick knuckle, and I'm going to put that together with the dust shield for the brakes so that I know how it all goes together when I try to put this back months from now.